In a quiet suburb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, life flowed steadily and calmly. Neat houses with well-kept lawns lined quiet streets where children played carefree and neighbors waved to each other. No one could have imagined that behind the facade of this idyllic picture lurked something so terrible that it would forever change the fates of many people and leave a deep scar in the history of the entire state. It all began with the disappearance of Emily Brooks, a 16-year-old schoolgirl who didn't return home after a party at her friend's. Initially, the police treated the case as a typical teenage runaway, but when her mutilated body was found in the woods outside the city a week later, it became clear that something much more sinister had occurred. Detectives John Harris and Sarah Cowan, veterans of the homicide department, were assigned to lead this case. They couldn't have imagined that this would be the beginning of the most terrifying investigation of their careers. As they delved into the details of the crime, a picture of unimaginable cruelty unfolded before them. Emily's body wasn't just killed, it was mutilated with surgical precision. Some organs had been removed, and strange symbols were carved into the skin, the meaning of which remained a mystery. Before the detectives could make progress in the investigation, another girl disappeared. This time, the victim was 22-year-old college student Rachel Summers. Her body was discovered 5 days later, and the crime scene was frighteningly similar to Emily's murder. It became clear that a serial killer was operating in the city. Panic gripped Milwaukee. People were afraid to leave their homes after dark, parents wouldn't let their children go to school, and local media was full of headlines about the Milwaukee butcher. The police were at a dead end without a single lead. But the true horror was yet to come. A month into the investigation, the detectives received an anonymous letter. In it, the killer, calling himself the artist, boasted of his deeds and hinted that this was only the beginning. He described his crimes as works of art and promised that his next exhibition would shake the city to its core. While the police tried to make sense of this information, the artist struck again. This time the victim was an entire family, a married couple, and their 2 children. Their bodies were discovered in their own home, located in the very center of that quiet suburb. The crime scene was so horrifying that even seasoned criminalists couldn't hold back tears and nausea. Harris and Cowan worked day and night, trying to decipher the killer's message and prevent new victims. They sought help from a criminal psychology specialist, Dr. Alex Foster. Foster, after studying the letter and photographs from the crime scenes, came to a shocking conclusion. They were dealing not with one, but with a group of killers. Foster's theory seemed incredible, but it explained the surgical precision and complexity of the crimes committed. According to his analysis, the group consisted of at least 3 people, a surgeon, an artist, and possibly a photographer or videographer documenting their work. While the police tried to make sense of this information, the artist struck again. This time, the victim was an entire family, a married couple and their 2 children. Their bodies were discovered in their own home, located in the very center of that quiet suburb. The crime scene was so horrifying that even seasoned criminalists couldn't hold back tears and nausea. The bodies were arranged in the living room like exhibits in a museum. Each body was mutilated in its own way, turned into a gruesome parody of a work of art. Complex patterns and symbols were drawn on the walls with the victim's blood, and in the center of the room stood a tripod with a video camera. Dr. Foster's theory about a group of killers was beginning to be confirmed in the most terrifying way. The video recording found on the camera shocked the investigators. It captured the last hours of the family's life and the entire process of their agonizing death. But the most terrifying thing was that the killers didn't hide their faces. They acted openly, as if not afraid of being caught. Detectives Harris and Cowan, after watching the recording, were shocked not only by the brutality of the criminals, but also by their cold-bloodedness. The killers acted methodically, almost ritually, turning each murder into a carefully staged spectacle of horror. It was obvious that they derived a perverted pleasure from their actions. Identifying the perpetrators became a priority task. To the investigators' surprise, The killers' faces didn't match any records in police databases. These people were ordinary citizens who had never been previously charged. This discovery raised an even more frightening question. How long had this group been operating undetected, and how many more unsolved crimes were on their record? The investigation gained momentum, but the killers seemed to always be one step ahead. They continued their horrible deeds, leaving behind increasingly shocking scenes. Each new crime was more brutal and sophisticated than the previous one. The city was plunged into an atmosphere of fear and paranoia. A breakthrough in the case came unexpectedly. One of the victims, who miraculously survived an attack, was able to provide a description of one of the assailants. It was a young woman who worked as a nurse at a local hospital. Her arrest led to the uncovering of the entire group. What the investigators discovered shocked even the most experienced of them. The group consisted of 5 people: a surgeon, an artist, a videographer, and 2 of their assistants. They were all ordinary people with families and respectable professions. No one could have thought that monsters were hiding behind the mask of well-being. Interrogations revealed the true depth of their madness. The killers considered themselves artists of death, striving to create a new form of art through suffering and death. They planned their crimes for months, choosing victims and thinking through every detail of their terrible performances. The trial of the death artists, as they were dubbed by the media, became one of the most high-profile cases in U.S. history. The testimonies and evidence presented in court shocked the public. It became known that the group operated not only in Milwaukee, but also in other cities across the country, leaving behind a trail of unsolved murders. All 5 were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But even after the sentencing, many questions remained. How could ordinary people turn into such monsters? What led them to create this group? And most importantly, how many more such groups might exist in the world, hiding behind a facade of normality? The case of the death artists forever changed Milwaukee and left a deep mark on the psyche of its residents. The city, once considered one of the safest in the country, was now associated with horror and fear. People became suspicious of their neighbors, friends, and colleagues, wondering who else might be hiding such terrible secrets. For Detectives Harris and Cowan, this investigation was the last in their careers. They couldn't recover from the horrors they faced and retired soon after the case was closed. Dr. Foster devoted the rest of his career to studying the psychology of group serial killers, trying to understand the mechanisms that lead to the formation of such terrible alliances. The story of the death artists became the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and scientific studies. It reminded the world that the most terrible evil can hide behind the most ordinary facade, and that the boundaries of human cruelty can be much wider than we can imagine. But the most frightening thing about this story is that it can be repeated in any city, at any time. For no one knows what dark secrets may be hiding behind the doors of a neighboring house, and what monsters may be hiding under the mask of an ordinary person. In the quiet town of Fresno, lost among the vast fields of California, a story began to unfold that would forever change the lives of its inhabitants. It all started with the disappearance of a young girl named Emily Stone. Her absence wasn't noticed immediately. Her parents thought she was staying with a friend, and her friends assumed she had gone away for the weekend with her family. It was only after 3 days that worry gripped the town. The police began their investigation, but there were hardly any clues. Surveillance cameras hadn't captured anything suspicious, and there were no witnesses. Emily seemed to have vanished into thin air. Weeks turned into months, and the case went cold. 6 months later, another girl disappeared, Sarah Johnson. This time, the town reacted instantly. Search parties combed every corner of Fresno, but to no avail. Fear began to seep into the hearts of the residents. People started locking their doors, and parents stopped letting their children play outside alone. Detective Michael Reynolds, leading both cases, felt he was missing something important. He spent sleepless nights studying every detail, every piece of evidence, and then he noticed a pattern. Both girls had disappeared during a full moon. The third disappearance occurred exactly a month after the second, again during a full moon. This time, the victim was a young man, Jason Pierce. Now, no one doubted, a serial killer was operating in the town. The FBI joined the investigation. Agent Samantha Black, a profiling specialist, arrived in Fresno. She immersed herself in studying the psychological profiles of the victims, trying to understand the killer's logic. Meanwhile, something terrible was happening in the dark corners of the city. In an abandoned house on the outskirts of Fresno, in a basement where daylight never penetrated, were the three missing people. They were alive, but their condition was horrifying. Emaciated, beaten, they barely grasped reality. Their abductor, a man everyone knew as the good-natured librarian Peter Clark, led a double life. By day, he checked out books and smiled at visitors. By night, he transformed into a monster obsessed with control and power over others' lives. Peter didn't just kidnap people. He conducted cruel psychological experiments on them. He tried to understand how long a person could maintain sanity under conditions of complete isolation and constant fear. He recorded every reaction of his victims, every scream, every tear. Agent Black, studying the victims' profiles, discovered that they were all frequent visitors to the city library. It was a thin thread, but she decided to check this lead. She began questioning library staff, and Peter Clark came into her field of view. Peter was the perfect suspect, quiet, unassuming, with access to information about the town's residents. But he had an alibi for all 3 nights of the disappearances. Surveillance cameras showed him working at the library until late at night. However, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She began digging deeper and discovered that Peter had grown up in an orphanage where he had been subjected to abuse. This could explain his psychopathic tendencies. Meanwhile, Peter was preparing for his next experiment. He had chosen a new victim, a young mother of 2 children. He planned to abduct her right from her home, in front of her children, to study how trauma affects the development of young minds. On the night of the planned abduction, Samantha and Detective Reynolds decided to follow Peter. They saw him leave the library, get into his car, and drive to the outskirts of town. They followed him at a safe distance until he stopped at an abandoned house. Peter went inside, unaware he was being watched. Samantha and Michael called for backup and decided to act. They burst into the house, but Peter managed to escape to the basement. What they discovered there exceeded their worst expectations. The 3 missing people were found, but their condition was horrifying. They were barely alive, their psyches broken by endless torture and experiments. Peter, cornered, didn't surrender. He took one of his victims hostage and threatened to kill her. A tense game of nerves began. Samantha tried to negotiate, using her knowledge of psychology to reach out to Peter's humanity. But there was nothing human left in Peter. He was ready to kill and die rather than fall into the hands of justice. At the last moment, when the situation seemed hopeless, Detective Reynolds made a desperate move. He lunged at Peter, risking his own life. A violent struggle ensued. Peter was strong, but years spent in the library had made him physically weaker. Reynolds managed to disarm him and put handcuffs on him. Peter Clark was arrested, but his arrest brought no relief to the residents of Fresno. The trauma inflicted on the town was too deep. People no longer felt safe even in their own homes. Peter's victims were rescued, but a long road to recovery awaited them. Physical wounds healed, but psychological scars remained. Many of them were never able to return to normal life. The investigation continued for several more months. It turned out that Peter had kept detailed records of his experiments. These diaries shocked even seasoned FBI agents. They revealed the depth of madness and cruelty that the human mind is capable of. The trial of Peter Clark became one of the most high-profile cases in California history. He showed not the slightest remorse. On the contrary, he was proud of his achievements. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But the story didn't end there. A year after Peter's arrest, people started disappearing in the town again. This time, the victims were young men. The police were baffled. Could Peter have had an accomplice? The new investigation led to a shocking discovery. It turned out that one of Peter's rescued captives, Jason Pierce, under the influence of the torture he had endured, had himself turned into a serial killer. He continued the work of his tormentor, believing that this was the only way he could rid himself of his demons. Fresno found itself trapped in an endless cycle of violence and fear. The town, once known for its fruit orchards and friendly residents, had now become a symbol of the dark side of human nature. This story became the subject of numerous studies by psychologists and criminologists. It showed how trauma can be passed from person to person, creating a chain reaction of evil. The residents of Fresno were never able to fully recover from these events. Even years later, people were wary of strangers and tried not to leave their homes after dark. Peter Clark remained in prison, but his influence on the town didn't cease. His story became an urban legend, frightening children and adults alike. Some even claimed to have seen his ghost wandering the streets during the full moon. Fresno became a living reminder that the most terrifying evil often hides behind the most ordinary facade, and that darkness, once released, can have far-reaching consequences. The town continued to live, but the shadow of the past forever remained a part of its history, reminding us of the fragility of the human psyche and how easily a person can turn into a monster. In the quiet town of Mill Creek, Washington, strange events began to unfold. Over the past 3 months, 4 people had been found dead in their homes. The police were baffled. No signs of forced entry, no obvious causes of death. The only thing connecting the victims was the expression of terror on their faces and strange symbols carved into their skin. Detective Emma Wright was assigned as the lead investigator on this case. An experienced criminologist, she was renowned for her ability to solve the most intricate crimes. But from the very beginning, this case was unlike any she had ever encountered before. Emma started by examining the victims' backgrounds. At first glance, there seemed to be nothing in common: different ages, professions, social status. But digging deeper, the detective discovered a connection. They had all, at different times, undergone treatment at the local psychiatric clinic, Pine Hills. The clinic had a reputation as a place that treated the most severe cases. Many patients hadn't left its walls for years. Emma decided to start her investigation there. The clinic's director, Dr. Harris, was not too pleased with the detective's visit. He hindered her attempts to talk to patients and staff, citing confidentiality. But Emma sensed he was hiding something. That night, the detective secretly infiltrated the clinic's archives. While reviewing old records, she stumbled upon the file of a certain John Doe, a patient admitted to the clinic 20 years ago. No data on his past, no relatives. The only note in the file stated, "Extremely dangerous. Keep in isolation." Emma continued her search and discovered that all the victims had, in one way or another, come into contact with this mysterious patient. Some had worked in his ward, others had undergone treatment at the same time. The detective was determined to find John Doe at all costs. But when she came to the clinic the next day, she was given shocking news. A fire had broken out in the isolated wing of the building overnight. The only patient held there had disappeared without a trace. Emma realized the killer was on the loose, and now he would seek revenge on everyone connected to his confinement in the clinic. A frantic search began. The police combed the town, but the killer seemed to have vanished into thin air. And then new victims started appearing. Now they were doctors and nurses from Pine Hills. The killer was becoming more vicious and elusive. Emma spent sleepless nights trying to unravel the mystery of John Doe. Who was he before he ended up in the clinic? Why was he so feared? And how did he manage to kill without leaving a trace? The answer came unexpectedly. While reviewing old town archives, Emma stumbled upon a mention of a series of brutal murders that had occurred in Mill Creek 20 years ago. The killer was never found, but witnesses described him as a man with unusual eyes, so dark that they seemed to have no pupils. The description matched the only surviving photograph of John Doe in the clinic's archive. Emma realized the serial killer hadn't been caught. He had simply been locked away in a psychiatric facility, hoping he would never get out. But now he was back to finish what he had started. Emma warned everyone who had ever worked at Pine Hills. But the killer was cunning. He penetrated the most secure homes, bypassed all traps. It seemed he could read his victims' minds. The detective realized that the only way to stop him was to lure him into a trap. She announced on television that she was ready to reveal the whole truth about the events of 20 years ago. It was bait that the killer had to take. On the night of the press conference, Emma waited in her house, surrounded by the police's best snipers. Cameras were set up everywhere, every angle was covered. The trap was set, but the killer proved smarter. He didn't come for Emma, he went after her family. The detective's husband and young daughter were kidnapped right from under the guards' noses. Emma received a message, "Come alone if you want to save them," and an address, an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. Knowing it was certain death, the detective still went to meet the killer. She knew it was the only way to save her family and stop the string of deaths. A nightmare awaited her at the factory. Emma's family was alive but bound, and next to them stood the man, with eyes like bottomless pits. John Doe, the serial killer, finally free. In the ensuing struggle, Emma realized she was dealing with more than just a man. John Doe possessed inhuman strength and speed. He seemed to anticipate her every move. But Emma had an advantage: love for her family and the desire to protect innocent people. At the crucial moment, she managed to push the killer into a vat of chemicals. John Doe's scream seemed to shake the walls of the factory, and then there was silence. Emma freed her family. The police, arriving at the scene, found no trace of the killer's body. He seemed to have dissolved. The town breathed a sigh of relief. The series of murders stopped, but Emma knew this wasn't the end. Somewhere out there, in the darkness, a monster was lurking, one that might return someday, and she would be ready to face him again.